I'm neither wearing a fabulous hat, nor do I have a parasol, nor do I have any tea. But I do have beer, which doesn't fit the theme of this book at all. This is, what am I drinking tonight? I'm drinking a Hefeweizen from Munich because I can. I should have had a parasol. I used to have a parasol, but I sold it when I moved. Because when I was moving, I sold a bunch of stuff to raise some money for moving, because that's what you do. And I haven't acquired a new parasol since. That's a pretty nice pour. Oh, just a little bit sloppy. Can't have a foamy-headed beer without a little bit sloppy. All right. So not on theme or on brand at all, but good evening. I'm the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome to the Vampire Book Club, where we're drinking a nice, weedy Hefeweizen tonight, because I can. This month, the Vampire Book Club read Soulless, book 1 of the Parasol Protectorate series. I'm going to turn up the slide a little bit. There we go. Now you can see it. And this copy I have happens to be the special illustrated edition. So I'm going to try to show you some of the pictures too, because they're really cool, by Gail Carriger. It is not a young adult novel, much to its reputation. It is a steampunk paranormal mystery that also has romance. And steampunk as a genre is set in a alternate history, Victorian times, usually England or some British colony. This one happens to be set in London. And how is it market itself? I'm looking in the front cover because they usually will put genres in here. Nope, no such luck this time. And what steampunk is, besides being set in fakey Victorian times, means that there are steam-powered machines that play a significant part of the plot. So there's dirigibles, there's weird contraptions, people wear goggles a lot. There's a lot of kind of Frankenstein-style electricity and switches and those kind of things. Steam-powered things, electricity-powered things, very mad scientist-y, and usually will have very spunky ladies. That's another very significant aspect of steampunk fiction. And steampunk is not always paranormal. So this is a paranormal steampunk mashup. Usually steampunk is more of the sci-fi variety, in that the science of the steampunk is sometimes fantasy, sometimes there's magic involved. But yeah, cogs and gears and steam and whistles and dirigibles and parasols and sort of like robots sometimes. But this one's also paranormal. Also has vampires and werewolves and ghosts. Or so we're told that it has ghosts. Ghosts don't really play a part in this. We're told that the ghosts are part of this world, but they don't really show up in this book. But this is a series. This is the first book in the series, so I'm presuming ghosts play a bigger part in the series as it goes on, as one does. So we read this book because we're a vampire book club, right? We read vampire books, but this is a monster mash book, has werewolves as well as ghosts. And as a vampire book goes, it's kind of light on the vampires, but because we are a vampire book club, we'll focus on those vampires for what they're worth. We're not a werewolf book club. We will mention the werewolves because they're important, but our focus will be on the vampires because they're better than werewolves. Try and stop me. My club, my rules. Have a drink. Yeah, I thought the ghost took a bigger part later. That makes sense. Fantasy horror is what it's called. I mean, anything that has monsters like werewolves and vampires is automatically horror. Twilight is automatically horror. Does Twilight feel like a horror novel? No, but it is in the horror genre according to the way publishers market things. But you wouldn't describe it to someone as horror. So even though this is technically horror in that it has monsters in it, it does not have a horror feel to it. It does have some blood and gore. Definitely some blood and gore. Definitely much more action, though. If you're unfamiliar with steampunk as a genre, you ever see that movie Wild Wild West? It's the only steampunk movie there is, or at least like the most famous one. That kind of feel, except much more lady-centric. whereas that's a very dude-centric movie. So, who is this lady, Parasol? Her name is Alexia, and we meet her on the first page. Even though it's not in her point of view, this is a very omniscient point of view of book. It's written in a very interesting style, third person, omniscient point of view, very close omniscient, and it's written like it's trying to parody Regency romance, which is an interesting choice because it's not set in the Regency era at all. But if you've ever read Jane Austen, or more specifically Jane Austen parodies or pastiches, it's written like it's making fun of those. So it's this very tongue-in-cheek kind of condescending narrative voice that doesn't seem to take anything seriously. So as I started reading it, I'm just thinking like, wow, if you just hate your genre this much that you're making fun of it this much, why should I like it? So it took me a while to get into the voice. I had the feeling the author was trying to do it lovingly, but it came across a lot more mean at first until I got used to it. So anyway, this main character, Alexia, on page 1, we find out that she is she's not a young debutante girl at a ball who's there to get a husband. No, she is old. She's 26. So she is much too old to be of a marriageable age, but she's kind of okay with that because she never thought she could get married anyway. So she never tried. She never debuted. She was a spinster, her word, from the age 15. So she's at this ball, not dancing, not having fun, hiding out in the library, because no one will ever want to marry her anyway. Why? Because she's got an attitude. She is a very spunky lady who has opinions and doesn't want to demur to anyone. So why bother trying to get her married? Her mom's not even going to try. Her mom has 2 other daughters that have much more genteel, ladylike attitudes, and she's going to try to get them married instead of her firstborn daughter, who had a different father than her other 2 daughters. And the thing about Alexia's father is he was Italian. And you know, Italians are high-spirited people, which is why she's so high-spirited. And they talk with their hands, and they have opinions and large breasts. And she's not skinny twig like the other girls. No, she's got curves in all the right places. She's got this hourglass figure and very large breasts, which is apparently a bad thing in this society, even though plenty of the men who look at her like it, but in like a gross way. But it's not marriageable. Women with large breasts, no. But yeah, she's curvy. She's tall. You know, men don't like tall girls. Because she's Italian, she gets tan very easily, so her skin is browner than the other girls. She's usually described as tan, but she only calls herself brown once. And she's got kind of a big nose. But besides the big nose, she's pretty. They're like, oh yeah, if it wasn't for that nose, she would actually be pretty. So she's, you know, kind of like Hollywood ugly. No one ever calls her ugly. They just don't think she's classically beautiful enough for any man to ever want to marry her, except for practically every man who actually looks at her in this book that we meet, because they all like her in spite of those things or because of those things. So the society is clearly wrong here. So we learn all this very fast about this character from the beginning. Yes. In proper English society, where everyone is pale and keeps themselves pale with their parasols, having a swarthy Italian complexion makes you unmarriageable. So she's a 26-year-old spinster who wouldn't want to deal with debuting anyway. So she's at this ball. She's hiding in the library because, you know, she's like a bookish, nerdy girl who likes books, unlike the other girls. She's very not like the other girls, which also turned me off from her at first because I like female characters that support other women and are like, you know, band together with other women, not who think women are stupid for liking feminine things, and only women who like more manly pursuits like reading about science are worth liking. You know, girly things are okay. So, as you can tell, I had a little trouble getting into this book, but I did get into it eventually, so don't worry, we'll get there. So she's in the library, hiding out, and then she gets attacked by a vampire. So great, vampires on page 1. That's great. I am here for it. So this vampire who attacks her doesn't know that she happens to be soulless. And what being soulless means is that if a supernatural creature like a vampire or a werewolf touches you, they immediately turn human to whatever their human state was before they became undead. And werewolves are undead. They stop aging just like vampires. They stay immortal and young forever. And they can't really go out in day. They kind of can more than vampires, but not really. So yeah. So this vampire tries to attack her. The second it tries to bite her, he turns back human. He's like, what's going on? I don't understand, because being with Soulless is very rare, and most people don't know she exists. Usually the vampires do, because they've been trained, but most human people don't know that. But this vampire doesn't, which is kind of mysterious and strange, right? So this vampire keeps trying to attack her, and she's like, I say, good sir, what's wrong with you? Don't you know you can't attack me? And she eventually has to slay him, because she's a badass lady. She's not a vampire slayer, and we find out later this is kind of the first time she's ever really slayed a vampire. But she happens to have a stake in her hair. Like, she wears a hairpin that's a vampire slaying stake, as you do if you live in a society with vampires. Why not? It's a smart move. And she uses that to slay this vampire, kind of by accident, but also not really. She also hits him a lot with her parasol, and she makes a big deal about this parasol, because the parasol is like, she's reinforced with silver, and she's got like weights in the end to make it really heavy, so she can like really kick some ass with this parasol. And then it makes a whole big deal of saying, I have a parasol at a ball, even though in this society, women would never bring a parasol to the ball. And it's really weird, but I did it anyway. And then every other time later on in the book where she could have really used her parasol, she doesn't have it. So I'm like, you name your whole series the Parasol Protectorate, and the parasol's there on page 1, even though it shouldn't be, and then isn't there for the rest of the book, except for when it's like actually serving its parasol function, which I thought was amusing. So she kills this vampire. And then, of course, there's a uproar at the ball. Everyone freaks out. Someone walks into the library and sees her there with the dead vampire. So she pretends to have just found it, not to have been the one to kill it. She pretends to have hit it. And then the cops show up because, of course, dead body at a ball, cops show up. And people in the society know about vampires. Vampires are part of society. They fit into society. Werewolves, too. Though people are still intimidated by them. They're intimidated by them kind of in the same way that people in the society were intimidated by rank and title and social class. And it's kind of a different strata of social class. So, cops show up. She's pretending to be fainted. And we're introduced to this cop-like character who's really, really mean. He's this gruff guy. He comes off as like older and mean and grumpy. This is like stereotypical police guy who just doesn't have time for ladies being women. And his name is Lord Macon. He's Scottish, so I guess it should be Laird Macon. It's spelled Lord. And he wakes her up and he's like, I know you're not really fainted. Get up. I know who you are. It turns out he's a werewolf. And his sidekick is also a werewolf. And they're from the special, like, supernatural police. And they've come to investigate this. It's not the regular police. So she's kind of buddies with them because she has a history of running into them because they know what she is. And if she were a man, she would be on this special supernatural police force. But because she's not a man, they can't hire her, even though she's the only soulless person around that has this magic ability that can stop vampires and werewolves. So they have a big fight. They're grumpy. They hate each other. He's clearly the love interest. But what surprised me about this introduction of this love interest character is we're not told that werewolves stay immortally young, right? That's not information we're given yet. So we're told that he's been leader of the London Werewolf Pack for 20 years. And he came from Scotland where he was a leader of his own werewolf pack there. So I'm assuming he's a much older guy, like 50, 60, like this older, really gruff, scrubby werewolf. And I'm like, oh, okay, we've got this 26-year-old woman and this like 60-year-old man romance. That's interesting. You don't see that often in romance. But you find out like 300 pages into the book that like, no, he is young and hot looking and has been this whole time. And they just never told us that apparently he was made a werewolf and stopped aging at a young age. They never tell us what age, but you want to see an illustration of him. It's not the way the book describes him at all. I was quite surprised that they drew him looking like a young, dandy, pretty boy when he's introduced as this very roughneck, blue-collar Scotsman who also is really rich and has a title of Earl. So even though he's like a total asshole, he's very marriageable. And even though he's an immortal werewolf who's 200 years old, women still want their daughters to marry him. So it's, you know, it's not cool for Alexia to be hanging out with him because she's unmarriageable, and that's, you know, she has no place with a man like this, even though he's written terrible. Where's that picture? Got to show you this picture. Okay, there he is. You can't really see his face. But you see like how young he looks. He looks like, sorry, the lighting's so bad. He reminds me of the nephew in Christmas Carol. You know, Scrooge's nephew, the very like foppy young guy. And I know this is just one artist's interpretation, but this is the official published version. And there is a manga version of this, and the manga version made him a little stockier looking, but still very young and pretty. Yeah, he seems like a very gruff 50s detective. You're right. Very kind of noir. Is he grabbing a titty? He might be grabbing her boob because he's very into her boobs. So we find out that this vampire that she slayed is a mystery because no one knows where he came from. And vampires are very closely regulated in the society. And it's very unusual for this random strange vampire to show up. They should know where he came from. So she is now the talk of the town because everyone wants to know how she killed him, who she is, what her magic power is, and what she knows about this mysterious vampire. So she gets an invitation. Well, the next morning, she's hanging out with her best friend, who she also kind of hates. Like, this girl, Alexia, does not like any other women whatsoever. She doesn't really like any men either, even though she's lusting for them. So her best friend, Ivy, who Alexia's just like constantly putting down and insulting, they're going for a walk in the park. And the strange lady rolls up in a carriage and invites Alexia to come to the Vampire Queen's hive that night. And we find out that the Vampire Queen is the leader of a certain hive of vampires in London, and there's multiple hives in London. This is the only one we're introduced to. And the way vampires work is that only queens, so cis women, I guess, can make other vampires by biting people. And the way you get made to be a vampire is if you've got enough soul in your body. So people have different amounts of soul in their body in this universe. So they believe. It's hinted later that this might not be true after all. But the more soul you have, the more likely you'll be able to make the crossing into becoming a vampire or a werewolf. And only the vampire queens can make new vampires. So usually they'll make other men into vampires because they don't want to create a new queen, because then that's like, you know, competition. So there's very few women vampires. Most of them are just these sexy guys. And so Alexia says, I got this invitation to go to this vampire queen. I'm going to ask my vampire buddy for advice before I go there. So she has a buddy named Lord Akadama, who is a vampire, but he doesn't belong to no hive. He's a lone wolf vampire. He doesn't answer to any queen. And he is what's called a rove vampire. And all vampires, hives, and roves have drones that work for them. And these drones are human servants, some of which want to become vampires. But the only people that can make a vampire is the queen. So any drones working for Lord Akadama who want to become a vampire would then have to go to this vampire queen over here and be like, please, ma'am, make me a vampire. And if they turn out to not have enough soul, they won't get turned into a vampire. So Alexia is the opposite of that. She has zero soul. And she meets with her friend, Lord Akadama, who is a very flamboyant fop, who is also gay. Most flamboyant fops are not gay, but he also happens to be gay. And he's basically, if Percy Blakeney from the Scarlet Pimpernel got made into a vampire, very stereotypical flaming homosexual character in, you know, Victorian top hats and tails. And he's a really nice guy. He gives her all the advice he can, which isn't much. So he says, I don't know anything about this random vampire. It's weird that she's summoning you to her hive, and good luck. You know, it's like, if you need help, I'll help you, but I don't know what I can do. So then she goes to the vampire queen to see her. And the vampire queen doesn't know anything. She's hoping Alexia knows something. She meets some other vampires there, and there are all these kind of like creepy guys who are all snooty high society types, but one seems kind of like mad scientist-y. And as she's leaving, she gets kidnapped. And she gets kidnapped by a mysterious coach. And driving the coach is this very strange figure. He looks like his face is made of wax. He's kind of like scarecrow looking. He's got this like really creepy features. He doesn't talk. He doesn't blink. And he's got this weird word written on his head. So he shoves her into this coach. And inside the coach, there's this other guy who's trying to chloroform her. And she fights him because, she's feisty. So she's fighting this guy, and then she hears a werewolf howl. And then the coach gets attacked by a werewolf, and then she gets rescued. And it's Lord Macon, her hate at first sight, argue all the time, not love interest, who just hates her and she hates him, and they just can't stand each other because they're both such alpha personalities, literally in werewolf terms, even though she's not a werewolf. And they had a few other interactions before this where he was just like, grr, and she was just like, meh, that's their whole dynamic. But he rescues her, and the creepy coach gets away, and he's got her rescued. And he's like, let me walk you home someplace safe. And they're kind of having this steamy moment where she's just like, oh, I'm so attracted to him, yet he's such a jerk. And he's like, oh, she's so sexy and has such big boobs, but oh, she just talks too much. Why won't she stop talking? I know how to make her stop talking. And he kisses her right there in the middle of the street. And she's like, and he's like, Mrr. And then he starts like chewing on her because he's a werewolf, and that's what wolves do, even in human form, I guess. So he's giving her these hickeys. He's like biting all over her neck, chewing on her. And then they get caught by his sidekick. His sidekick shows up. Meanwhile, his sidekick has gone on this mission to try to find more information about this random strange vampire. And he's gone out to the coast where he found out that lone werewolves who aren't part of a pack have been disappearing. Lone vampires have been disappearing. People that aren't part of packs or hives have been disappearing, and it's very mysterious. So you've got vampires and werewolves disappearing, and then random new vampires appearing out of nowhere who don't know the rules. And, it's a mystery. So the psychic interrupts him, and they're like, oh no, we were making out in the middle of the street. How impropriety. So he puts her in a taxi, takes her home, and she goes home. And then the next day there is a ball, because of course there is. It's like a big party. Yeah, the sidekick, the beta werewolf, is your classic steampunks, like professor character. So he's got like the goggles, and instead of writing with a pencil on paper, he has to write with acid on metal, because that's what you do in steampunk. You write with acid